Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is the second in the preservation series, and I wanted to talk about canning. Canning is, we tend to think of it, or at least I tend to think of it, as like this old practice that like everybody did for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, but it's very modern. In fact, Napoleon pretty much came up with it, not personally, but an army travels on its stomach and he was willing. It might have been Napoleon the Third, but I think it was the first Napoleon. Oh crap. Well, anyway, Napoleon army travels on its stomach, and foodborne illnesses were super common for armies back then. Actually, illnesses in general tended to do almost as much, if not more, damage than the opposing army. So he was like, "How are we gonna feed people on these long campaigns, especially in the tropics?" So he offered a reward to anybody who could solve this. And somebody, I wish I knew the guy's name, but he had determined that if you heated up food in a closed in container, like a can or a jar in these instances, that you could create a vacuum, one, and then also the heat would pasteurize, which was a relatively new concept, the food within, and as a result, you could literally have food that just lasted borderline indefinitely. Obviously, no vacuum in nature is perfect, and ultimately things would deteriorate. Entropy is inevitable, but you could make things last a really long time. And fun fact, the can actually predates the can opener by like 20 years. So before that, you just used a knife or a rock and you just went to town on it till you got the food out of it. But the bottom line is it's a relatively new thing. It's not something that's been around for nearly as long as you might think. And I'm not trying to shoehorn this into the vid, but it's something that occurred to me. And if anybody has an answer for me who doesn't ascribe to germ theory, and please be civil about it because I'm asking a genuine question. I'm not making an argument here. But if germ theory is not real, then why does canned food work? Like, what causes foodborne illnesses if it's not pathogens? And why would canned food I mean, you get the idea. If you eat canned beef stew that was canned 8 months ago, you're fine. But if you eat beef stew that you made on the stove 8 months after the fact, you're going to get very sick and die. So, what causes that if not pathogens, if not germs? Anyway, more importantly, though, back to canning. The best thing about canning, and one of the reasons why I wanted it to be the second video, is because you can do it with literally anything. Literally, just name a food you can do that with. It's kind of amazing. You can can mushrooms, you can can vegetables, you can can fruits, you can can meat, you can can dairy, you can can just about anything. It's kind of nuts because really what you're doing is you're heating the food to the point that the pathogens within are dying before they can reproduce and make enough toxins to damage the body. That's incidentally how it happens: is the pathogens produce toxic compounds, and then continuously, beyond killing the pathogens themselves, because you're creating a vacuum in a can, opposite of fermentation, the previous episode, where you have a living thing that needs to breathe. Instead, you're creating a sealed environment where pathogens can't go in or out, and as a result, you're making sort of a time frozen state for dead food. Because I mentioned before that when all food that we eat, excluding salt, which is a mineral, it comes from cells, and when those cells die, when they have a naturally occurring death, they start to atrophy because bacteria start to colonize them. So what you're really doing is you're taking these cells that have absolutely died. At the very least, the pasteurization process is going to kill them, but you're arresting the deterioration. So that's how canning works, which is really cool. It's also more dangerous than any of the other preservation methods. And that's not me issuing it as a warning or saying like, oh, don't do that, don't can. I'm just saying you have to take more precautions. Canning is, compared to pickling and all the subsequent episodes I'm going to mention, like freezing and certainly cellaring, it's more complicated because you need to ensure that you have reached a temperature and a time period where things in that jar are dead, and you have to ensure that a vacuum seal takes place. And in order to do that, you have to have the right equipment. You absolutely do need stovetop equipment where you can heat that water and plunge those jars into a boiling bath. And you do need to be careful about that because, again, if you fill the jars up too much instead of a vacuum, you're going to make the jars rupture. And conversely, if you leave too much air, the vacuum seal is not going to last very long. Now, fortunately, most jarred foods, and this is the same for the cans that are tremendously inspected and have great quality control and all that at the grocery store. In general, the bacteria that do colonize them to a point that would be dangerous for a person, they produce waste products, and those waste products are gases. And as a result, if you open a can of most things, there's a few exceptions, like surströmming is supposed to do this, which I've never had, but it's supposed to do this. Most food products that have been colonized by dangerous pathogen, they'll produce a hissing sound when you open it. If you open a jar and it hisses, that means that there's an excess of some sort of gas in it post vacuum sealing, which means something's wrong. So you never eat any kind of jarred or canned food that produces a massive outburst. That's the important part. Outburst of air or gas in this case. Whereas in the case of vacuum sealed, and you see this with commercial jarred products too. If the seal doesn't make that noise, then something's up. Exactly the same in the case of jarred goods. There's usually a seal on most jar lids that will tell you when you open it. If it doesn't have that nice little click noise, something's up. And if it hisses, something's really up. So that's something to be aware of because that's one of the big red flags. Additionally, discoloration or peculiar odors. Human instinct is great at determining the safety and efficacy of things. And if your nose is telling you that it's not good to eat, it's almost certainly not good to eat. Your instincts are telling you, hey, there's compounds in this that's not going to give you a good time. So those are the three big warnings. You want to have that vacuum seal noise. You don't want to hear a hissing noise. And it should look and smell like it was before you canned it. Because again, you're arresting it. It's not like fermentation. Fermentation, from the smell. It should smell like acetic acid or lactic acid. Whereas in this case, it should smell like what it smelled like before you canned it. It should smell like beef stew or milk or flipping peppers or whatever. It should have that aroma. And by the way, speaking of which, certain herbs and spices do aid that process. That is to say, they discourage bacteria. The reason why humans like capsaicin, hot stuff, is because it actually wards off sources of pathogens, namely insects. So adding something that's a little spicy, if you like that, to your canned and jarred foods, it's not like going to make a huge difference, but it could give you the edge, especially if you're doing like prepping stuff. It could be the difference between like an extra week shelf life, and maybe that matters. So, and for me personally, I just like hot stuff, but you get the idea. But the bottom line is the canning process is you take the food, you add it to a certain level, and I highly recommend you guys do some of your own research on this just because it is a more exact process. But you add a sufficient amount of insert canned product. You usually add moisture to said canned product. There are a handful of exceptions, particularly foods that are already really high in moisture. But in general, you're going to add some form of moisture, both to conduct heat as well as to help with that seal, namely water. That's the most common. But again, this is one of the reasons why people like to can soups, because it provides sufficient moisture without watering down the food itself. Then you're going to add it to the hot water bath. And once it reaches a certain preferred temperature, and it varies depending on what you're canning. That's one of the reasons why I say this is an exacting kind of thing. But once it hits a certain temperature, it'll create a seal, or this is a common thing, at least with the stuff I've canned. Quite often, it won't make an immediate seal, but you'll hear it seal up once it's taken out and cools. And that makes perfect sense when you think about it in terms of like the physics of what's happening, because the vacuum seal isn't created by the heat, it's created by the cooling from the heat. So what's ultimately happening is hot air expands, and so there's more, there's not more air, but there's bigger air in the can, and cold air contracts. And so once it cools to a certain temperature, it will contract enough that it will create a very small vacuum, but that small vacuum within it is enough to seal the enclosure and prevent more air from entering. And preventing more air from entering means that you have a closed environment. And having a closed environment means that any kind of pathogen is not going to be able to enter from outside. And any pathogens that did survive the pasteurization process, most pathogens are either aerobic or anaerobic. Well, there's not going to be enough gases of whatever, in the case of aerobic, oxygen, in the case of anaerobic, whatever other compounds happen to be in the atmosphere, for them to respire functionally and continue to survive. So that's how that process gets arrested. And then once it's sufficiently cooled enough to handle, then you can just put it up in your pantry or your root cellar or wherever it is that you happen to want to keep it. The big thing post-canning is just to limit ultraviolet light, because ultraviolet light tends to degrade things, and that'll cause discoloration, nutrient loss, and it's just not recommended. I mean, very few things that you want to preserve benefit from having UV light, and that goes for everything: freezing, pickling, cellaring, and canning and jarring. Like, all preservation sort of relies on the idea of putting it in a cool, dark place. Everything always benefits from a cool, dark place if you're trying to preserve something. So just be aware of that. That rule applies every episode and every topic when it comes to preservation. That's all I got. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.